and we got some interesting invariants for the cell data, which I didn't show here, but again, we don't know what they mean. So we have these beautiful constant things, and we think that we kind of are beginning to understand, but the cells are trying to regulate something. And the question is, what is it? And it reminds me a little, if you think about, if you take the pendulum and you go back, I don't know, 300 years, okay, and you show the mathematicians from 300 years ago, you show them the equation for the energy of a pendulum. They could plug in the numbers and they could do the arithmetic and they can see that it's invariant, but they had no concept of energy. They didn't know what kinetic energy, potential energy, they didn't know what these things are. So the equations will be totally meaningless. But today we say energy and everybody here knows what I mean when I say energy. So we're missing some concepts. So when we look at these equations for the cells that are invariant, we get the equations, but we don't know what they mean. Maybe it means nothing, but maybe it's some concept that we don't know yet what it is. And how do we, can we get the machine to explain that concept to us? Maybe we can do that, but maybe it's going to be like trying to explain Shakespeare to a dog. And there's just no way to do that. So the answer is we're getting equations, but we don't know what they mean, and maybe that's the future of science.
So I really know very little about this. This may be total gibberish, but I'm really wondering about sort of how idealized this version of evolution is, in that, like Kat mentioned, there are hitches in the system for evolution, and we mess up. We have mental illness. People kill themselves. Like things happen to sort of, in an evolutionary sense, I just sound like a horrible callous person, weed out the defects to create a more perfect system. So how idealized is this in your machines? Do they all evolve correctly, per se? Do they create bugs? Do they weed themselves out? Like, how does that work in a more sort of less idealistic version of evolving and evolution?
Yeah, so this is an excellent question. This is a idealized version. We are keeping this very, very simple, but even in our very, very simplified systems, we still get all these pathologies that you described. We get robots that have the wrong self-image. We get robots that think they're big, but they're small. We have robots that are small, that are big, but they're small, but think they're big. And we have all we have pathologies. We have all these different issues. And initially, we threw all these away. We said, okay, these are all bugs. Let's run it again and see if it works. But increasingly, we're looking at all these pathologies and problems and divergence in evolution as means to study evolution, to study human cognition, to understand these pathologies in self-perception of people, in cognitive science and so forth. So on one hand, these, from an engineering point of view, these are problems, but on the other hand, from a scientific point of view, these are all opportunities to look at these more complex real systems like biology and human cognition in a much more simple system that is a little bit more transparent. And using that simplified, more transparent system, we might be able to have another window into how things go wrong and what we can do about it. So I think it's a tool that allows us to explore more, but it absolutely happens.
Yes, you remarked earlier, how do you get robots to model each other? And then you use the expression self-reflecting systems. Now that's a kind of metaphor. And I know you can't speak to us in code, but how do we connect our own sense of self-reflection to that of a robot?
That's $1 million question. I don't know how to do that, but it's one of these things. I have a feeling that the way that machines model themselves and machines model other machines is related to the way that we model ourselves, or the way we humans see ourselves. I think it's related, it has to do with the same type of processes. It's obviously not the same thing, it's obviously a lot simpler, the robot, than the human, but I think it's related, and how it's related, I don't know, but I think it's on the same path. If we want to understand human self-awareness, for example, and self-reflection, these kinds of systems might offer us, again, a kind of window into a similar kind of process.
In your evolutionary model, you have like mutations, but how do you generate mutations, and how large do you make the mutations, and like what effect does it have on the final product and the speed with which you get the final product?
There's a million details in the type of mutations and the size, and the size changes and it adapts depending on all kinds of things. I can't even answer that in any systematic way, because every system has different settings and different coefficients and so forth. But a lot of this is, it's not even, it has to do with the way you represent the actual things that you're evolving. So if you're evolving shapes, you represent it in a particular way, that the mutations and the crossover applies to that representation. If you're evolving robots, if you're evolving equations, each system has its own representation. In fact, finding the representations is half the challenge in doing this sort of thing. So I know it doesn't answer your question, but there are lots and lots of details to make that work.
This is a follow-up to something earlier. Lev Matovich, who's an experimental psychologist and an artist, says that the media are externalizations of mind. So is it possible you're building robots that are more reflective of the human condition rather than the reverse? Probably. There's a lot in the way that we, the reason why are we interested in recreating life in this, why are we so obsessed with evolving things that look like people and that behave? Why are we interested in explaining self-awareness and all these things? Probably a lot of it has to do with our own self-reflection process, and this entire expedition is at the core trying to look at ourselves. But I'll be speaking for myself here in that way. In general, I think you'll find that people looking in robotics, working in robotics, tend to divide between two things. Some people want to just make machines for the practical applications, for the sake of automation, and some people look at robotics as a tool to learn more about ourselves. And I think I definitely belong to the latter, but that's definitely a big piece of the motivation.
So I did some back of the envelope, and so if you say that maybe biological evolution has developed 10 to 9 bits of information, like the human genome or whatever, more or less, and it's had like 10 to the 11th or so generations to do this, and evolutionary computation tends to generate maybe 10 cubed bits of information tops in about 10 cubed generations. So do you think the resource gap there that generates the same kind of complexity we see in biologically evolved systems is going to be met through hardware engineering and increasing resources from pure engineering, or do you think that there's a conceptual leap that'll generate billions of bits of information in thousands of generations of very clever evolutionary simulation?
All of it.
All of it.
All of it. So I think so I don't know what the answer is. We can the fact that it took evolution a long time to do it doesn't mean that if you run it again, it needs to take just as long. Maybe you can do it faster, and maybe we can use all kinds of tricks to accelerate the process, like starting at a more advanced
level. We don't have to start with primordial soup. We can start, we can skip 2 billion years ahead and start with more advanced building blocks. And we can also maybe set things up in a more efficient way. We don't have to rediscover things many times, but we can detect things, and so there's a lot of things we can do, and we'll see if it works.
Two quick questions. One is the little, what do you call that robot that's got the 4 sort of starfish legs? Does it have a name?
Starfish is a...
Starfish? I'm curious, when that thing goes into its days of testing its various models of self, to see which ones, does it sit there in the dark and throb and twist as it tests those very little perturbations?
Exactly.
Oh my God, okay, I'd love to see that. And second is...
It's not very exciting, I have to say. It just sits there and ponders about itself and then moves a little bit. It's not very, very exciting to watch. You definitely have to accelerate the video.
So the other question is anybody following up with a more bipedal shaped robot? Because I couldn't help but think it was like baby starfish learning to walk. And I'd love to see if crawling and rolling and things like that would emerge from just that simple.
Right, so these are no, nobody's looking at it in this context, but that would be an interesting experiment to do. One of the things that immediately come to mind is, why didn't it evolve an evil spidery walk? Why did it create that way of moving forward? And maybe it has to do with the fact that the environment was very simple. Maybe if we gave it more time, it will learn how to walk, but given only 4 days, it learned how to crawl, and that's not bad. And all these kinds of interesting questions would be fascinating to explore, and that would be a good thing to do.
Hello. It seems like you have a really interesting approach, and thanks for making it public. Now I am hopeful that I can graduate this. and you showed many examples that you were able to govern the dynamics of the system, and you also mentioned the stock exchange that the approach didn't work. So I just want to ask, do you have an idea on what types of settings or systems this approach can work, on what types of systems this doesn't work? And I want to specifically ask for this social systems. Now we can get like lots of data like through cell phones about people, how they interact with each other, and through the internet and everything. So can this be applied to social science?
So you want to know how to predict the stock market? The answer is, well, so I should say that a lot of people have been able to use these techniques for stock market, for example, and other social systems. And a lot of it has to do with what you model. So when we tried it with just plain data, it didn't work. But I've seen a lot of people work on this kind of thing, and in fact, I know they're successful because they've written blogs about it, and then they take the blogs down, which means that and I wish I had saved it before. But what they look at is first of all, it has to do with what data you put in, and and the type of models that you create. So a lot of it has to do with creating stochastic models instead of trying to predict, let's say, behaviors, predicting distributions, predicting different types of things. And I think there are lots and lots of applications for these types of things. I've seen there's a lot of people who use this sort of, these sort of processes for modeling their own data that they collect about themselves. There's this movement, the quantified self. People are collecting information about their own behavior, and the sleep pattern, and what they eat, and the sugar levels, and all these types of things. They put all this data in, and they create models, and they use these models to make predictions about things. And so there's a lot of opportunities. Like you say, there's more and more data that people collect about themselves, about their interactions. And a lot of this data is not, we're swimming in this data. We want to create insight from this data, and these tools can help. So, one of I think the issues that keep coming up is that a lot of the science, let's say National Science Foundation, focuses on big science, on how we do big things, but a lot of the challenges are actually small science. It's people collecting data about their own behavior, and they want to create models, and they want to understand what's going on. Not big science, small science, and we have a lot of interesting new opportunities there, like you say. So that's interesting new frontier.
Okay, how about one last question?
I have a question about the starfish and the development, whether you, perhaps I missed it, but did you program it to, or set up the controllers for the bias towards movement, or did it want to explore its capacity?
So there were two phases there. The first phase was just for the machine to create a model of itself. And the second phase was to use that model to move. So we put in the bias towards motion, and then it created that undulation towards movement. But interestingly, we could only do that because we had access to the self-image, and we could reward the machine for moving itself. But if we couldn't understand how it modeled itself, we couldn't reward it for doing anything in particular. And so as the self-models become more sophisticated, it becomes difficult to reward the machine for doing anything because we can't access that self-model. So it's a little bit of a philosophical issue, but
I didn't realize its capacity, you couldn't direct it or reward it.
we can, the only thing we can do is we can realize what the machine wants to do and use that to make it do other things. You can, for example, you can find out that the mouse likes cheese, and then you can put a cheese at the end of the maze, and you can make the mouse go through the maze, but you can't actually truly understand how the mouse sees itself. And that's part of the one of the things that we'll see more and more with robotics as the self-image of the robot becomes more and more opaque to us.